scope is challenging, even when it's pretty obvious to to some of the experts out there. But how do they get that voice up there? And I think what Elon Musk has been able to do, and again through President Trump's leadership, is to make sure that this doesn't disappear, that there is sustained attention to it, and that is going to mean that some messiness will occur. Right? You're going to have to put holds on things to make sure that we're not spending wastefully. And I think that is, on net, is going to be valuable as we try to reform a federal government, particularly in light of the fact that we're $36 trillion in debt. We are spending my children's money and your children and grandchildren's money. We're spending their money now, and we better make sure that if we're going to do that, because sometimes it is necessary to take out debt, for example, for war purposes of fighting wars, that we're doing that for good reason. And I think that means that we really need to be really kind of, I think, rinsing out the kind of towel of government spending and make sure that only what survives is necessary.
Oh, thank you. And there are so many analogies that we could use. You know, we're breaking up the boulder of federal government, and there are some gems that we will be able to pull out of there, but the rest is rubble, and it needs to go away. And I know from the chairman, Chairman Paul, Senator Johnson, Senator Langford, and I have all engaged in these efforts, each of us, for over a decade now, in attempting to identify the waste, the fraud within our federal government, trying to get those reforms over the finish line. And it wasn't until we had the Trump presidency and the appointment of those in the Department of Government Efficiency with Elon Musk that we actually have the opportunity to do that now. And I know I'm way over, but we'll go ahead and close out, but I'll give you some closing thoughts as well. And I just want to be clear, you know, as we're talking about this, that there are many other groups that are supported by USAID that are doing great work, as I said, that help us care for orphans. There are programs that help us care for people with HIV. Those are important programs. But imagine how much more good work could be done if we use those dollars that instead ended up enriching terrorists and mad scientists in adversarial countries. So
we will look at those hundreds of millions of dollars of government contracts from Elon Musk, as he's cutting off funding to programs that clearly the administration doesn't understand or they may not agree with politically. Let's be clear, the Constitution does not empower a social media billionaire with massive conflicts of interest that has never been vetted to decide on how taxpayer dollars are spent. In fact, the Constitution doesn't even empower President Trump to make these decisions. The Constitution gives Congress, and only Congress, the sole power to decide how taxpayer money is spent. And for the most part, we pass bipartisan laws to determine how that money should be spent. But President Trump has directed Elon Musk and many other cronies to ignore Congress, to ignore the Constitution, and recklessly and illegally cut off funding that Congress has passed according to the law. Not only is it illegal, not only is it unconstitutional, but President Trump's direction to shutter USAID will have damaging consequences across the globe and here in the United States. I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, numerous statements from organizations and experts that detail those consequences.
Without objection.
That's why my Democratic colleagues and I are most concerned about what the agency, what federal programs is going to be next. Where are the dominoes going to fall after USAID? What's going to be next on the chopping block? We know President Trump has already directed his cronies to shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Will they halt Social Security payments that seniors count on next? Will they stop Medicare reimbursements and prevent seniors from accessing health care? Will they block disaster aid to states that have suffered from hurricanes and wildfires? Well, I'll tell you, President Trump and his cronies have already hinted on all of those resources that Americans count on, and more could be shut down going forward. And it's not just that it's illegal. It's not just that it violates the separation of powers. The bottom line is that these actions hurt American families, and it's our job to fight back. And that's why Democrats on our committee will be focused on that today. If this committee is seriously about defending American families and Congress's oversight role, a role, Mr. Chairman, that I know you have said over and over again as part of what we were going to be doing here at the committee. Then the hearing we have today should be about examining blatantly illegal activities that President Trump has led to undermine the laws passed by Congress and to wreak havoc on the programs and services that support Americans. Mr. Chairman, I know you've often talked about how it's Congress versus the executive, whoever's in the executive office. That's what's happening right now. Let's hope we focus on that because we're seeing it in clearly happening. At President Trump's direction, Elon Musk and his minions have illegally cut off funding that Congress passed to support farmers. They've cut off funding to support childcare centers. They've cut off funding for life-saving cancer research. They've cut off funding for community health centers, cutting off funding for religious charities and services that Americans rely on every day. And it's all been under the guise of addressing waste. But if the administration is serious about combating waste and fraud, then the president would not have fired 18 inspector generals, the independent watchdogs who actually identify waste, fraud, and abuse. Why is Donald Trump firing the watchdogs to waste and abuse? If the president is truly serious about addressing waste and fraud in foreign aid, he certainly would not have fired the inspector general for the USAID. And let's remember, this isn't the first time a president has tested the limits of law when it comes to presidential powers. We've seen this movie before. But it's the first time that Republicans in Congress have simply rolled over and let a president seize power that the Constitution assigns to the legislative branch. We have the power of the purse, and I've heard the chairman talk about that many times in our meetings. But let's look at an example from history. In the 1970s, when President Richard Nixon refused to spend money appropriated for child care, job programs, environmental cleanup programs, and virtually every member of Congress from both parties rejected that, passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which asserted Congress's constitutional power. And when it passed unanimously. Every Republican senator, we did not have feckless Republican senators, but it was a great time to look at how we came together to stand up to presidential power. And it wasn't just Congress. President Nixon lost in the courts over and over again. No judge ever endorsed President Nixon's argument that he had the right to ignore the laws of Congress. If President Trump thinks his actions are lawful, then his administration should come forward and be able to answer straightforward questions from Congress. They should operate in the light of day instead of trying to hide what they're doing from Congress, the courts, and independent watchdogs. Mr. Chairman, I was disappointed that over the last few weeks I've had to walk through those letters in the near future. And I think also, Mr. Chairman, many of the questions that we have today about the actions of President Trump that has been directed by Elon Musk, I think that's something that we should also call in Elon Musk to ask questions, particularly about his numerous and substantial conflicts of interest while he's making these kinds of decisions. And I hope that going forward, this committee will work to defend Congress's role and responsibilities under the law and conduct real, meaningful oversight of these lawless actions by the Trump administration.
Please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Need my intros.
It's in the top.
All right. Okay. Michael Schellenberger is a best-selling author and journalist who writes on a wide range of topics, including free speech, censorship, and the environment. He is the community-based research chair of politics, censorship, and free speech at the University of Texas, Austin. He also founded the online newsletter, Public, and the research organization Civilization Works. Mr. Schellenberger, welcome to the committee. Mr. Schellenberger, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and member of the committee. Thank you for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has had as its mission the promotion of America's values of free speech, democracy, and free markets by helping others abroad. The name suggests that the organization is focused on aiding poor nations in ways that result in their economic growth. Why then has USAID been spending so much money on information control and information operations, both in the form of demanding censorship by social media platforms and by financing supposedly independent journalism? Why is the United States government in general, and USAID in particular, the largest donor to supposedly independent media worldwide? For example, USAID in 2021 published a disinformation primer that urged greater censorship by social media platforms, as well as disfavored by the government without thinking. USAID may have been doing and funding worthwhile projects, and it may be that Congress will need to pass legislation to continue those projects through the State Department. But it's inaccurate to suggest that the USAID closure and freeze on aid will kill African children, as some have done, or cause other harms. The Trump administration has already created a waiver for HIV treatment and resumed aid for tuberculosis, malaria, and newborn health. And USAID's health programs should be subject to scrutiny given the agency's history of using such programs as cover for other activities, including regime change and biodefense research. For example, under President Barack Obama's administration, USAID was caught using an HIV program to foment rebellion in Cuba. USAID used EcoHealth Alliance as a pass-through organization to funnel $1.1 million to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was conducting risky gain-of-function experiments that may have caused the COVID pandemic. USAID gave EcoHealth Alliance $54 million during that period, which was more even than the $42 million the group received from the Pentagon. As such, anyone who believes in public health for poor people and poor nations must agree that USAID needs to be reined in and cleaned up. That starts first with precisely the kind of audit some members of Congress are trying to stop. USAID and all other government agencies must justify what they're spending their money on. The public's interest is ensuring that every dollar of taxpayer money is accounted for and justified. As recently as 2021, the media acknowledged the obvious. That year, the New York Times published an article headlined, "U.S. aid to Central America hasn't slowed migration. Can Kamala Harris?" In it, the Times acknowledged that experts say the reasons that years of aid have not curbed migration is in part because, quote, much of the money is handed over to American companies which swallow a lot of it for salaries, expenses, and profits, often before any services are delivered. That's precisely the reason, President, on USAID's wastefulness in general, I would like to focus the committee's attention on USAID's efforts to take control over independent investigative journalism and to advocate censorship in particular. Together, USAID's censorship and disinformation activities comprise a complete vision of information control in service of regime change that USAID and other U.S. government agencies have sought in dozens of foreign nations over the last 75 years. USAID in recent years has been funding censorship advocate funding. Another wild conspiracy theory, of course, Senator, was that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian disinformation effort. We now know
which, by the way, the ranking member accused me when I was investigating that of soliciting, disseminating Russian disinformation on that. Wrote an actual Senate report, falsely accused me of that, but go on.
Right. And of course, now we know the FBI had the laptop in, I think, November or December 2019. They then got the Aspen Institute to engage in what's called pre-bunking or a kind of brainwashing, convincing journalists and social media platforms that there would be a Russian hack and leak that fall involving Hunter Biden and Burisma. That's an illegal weaponization of the FBI, of a U.S. government contractor and grantee, Aspen Institute. These things have not been fully investigated, but we know, thanks to the Twitter files, that this was the illegal weaponization of our government agencies in order to spread a conspiracy theory in service of demanding censorship, which is what they then did when the New York Post article came out in October.
I also have to point out that I was a target of that pre-bunking campaign when both Senator Grassley and I received an unsolicited briefing by the FBI that we are targets of Russian disinformation. To this day, we have not found out who directed that briefing. So, Mr. Ruger, do you want to defend yourself from being accused of a conspiracy theorist?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a theorist. I'm an international relations theorist. So I think what I said is definitely within the broad tradition of political realism that has served this country well, really focusing in on, I think, the importance of our strength and how we defend and deter against enemies. And really, I think, applying good economic analysis to aid programs and other government programs because they need to pass a cost-benefit analysis. too often, I think, and especially given what we talked about with the $36 trillion in debt, we're not applying good trade-off decisions in terms of how we spend our money. And I think, again, that's one of the reasons why it's really important that we focus in on this. And I applaud what President Trump is doing here, because somebody has to get a handle on this. And I think it's a good stimulant for Congress to do its own work to help support the president in making sure we're protecting taxpayer money.
So we're a very compassionate people. We are. We want to help people. We want to help combat AIDS and feed the world. Where did USAID go off the rails? I mean, it was established, I think, good purpose. I mean, even things like Radio Liberty, those types of efforts seem to make sense. But where did they go off the rails? Mr. Schallenberger, do you have a theory on that?
I mean, for me, it's this effort, the regime change effort that then resulted in this effort that really starts in around 2007, 2008. It's led by USAID. USAID creates and provides all of the initial funding. It was from the State Department originally.
So who was in charge back then?
Of USAID, I believe. Well, that was 2008. So President, I'm not sure.
So under the Bush administration,
it was under the Bush administration.
Started going off the rails. Mr. Ruger, do you have any idea? What's your theory of when the South started going south or going left?
Well, I mean, again, one question really at the beginning is how effective are these types of assistance programs, period? So you could argue that in some senses, this went off the rails from the very beginning because it opens the door to the idea that that there is potentially no limit to what could be effective for the United States if we spend that money abroad. But in fact, that isn't. Part of it is fundamental to a program where you're spending millions and billions of dollars across the globe in a way that is very difficult to achieve accountability, particularly if those within the bureaucracy are less subject to the kind of incentives that care about how this money is spent.
Thank you, Mr. Ruger. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Donald Trump and Elon Musk illegal dismantling of federal agencies will definitely harm the safety and financial security of American people. We've seen already, and we're hearing about their unlawful government actions related to USAID, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB. Conveniently, just as President Trump's top lieutenant and his mega donor, the man with incredible conflicts of interest, Elon Musk, he's about to launch a new payment system at his company X. And that company would have been subject to CFPB regulation. But now Trump has decided to dismantle that agency. I may also say the CFPB has also received hundreds of complaints about Musk. A man who has not been vetted is now working to destroy an agency that would actually oversee his operations and operations that have received complaints because of the actions that he's taken. CFPB was created by Congress with bipartisan support and in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Its mission is to protect companies from Americans from scams and predatory companies. CFPB has improved American lives by capping credit card late fees, bank overdraft fees, reduced junk fees, has banned medical debt on credit or illegally destroying the agency. And let's be clear, this is an agency that has saved American taxpayers $21 billion. Saved taxpayers $21 billion. And it's in the sight of unvetted billionaire, huge conflicts of interest, Musk, who wants to destroy it because it would oversee his new business venture. So with CFPB shuttered, seniors, veterans, student borrowers are going to be at risk of unfair financial service practices, including debanking, payday changes with the Military Lending Act, where financial institutions taking advantage of the men and women who are serving our country. They counted on the CFPB to protect them. Nope. Trump and Musk, get rid of that. Forget saving money for taxpayers. We don't like these regulatory actions over banks and payday lenders and people like Elon Musk. So with CFPB shuttered, seniors, veterans, student borrowers are going to be at risk of unfair service practices on a regular basis, and it'll only let companies. So who will President Trump and Musk's next target be? Well, it looks like it's the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. The FAA works 24/7 to provide the safest flight experience across the country. And after the January 29th crash at Ronald Reagan National Airport, Americans are now more than ever concerned about having safe air travel. However, just days before that tragic crash, President Trump encouraged air traffic controllers to resign. We already have a shortage of air traffic controllers, and the president urged them to resign, knowing shortage, it takes months, years to train air traffic controllers. And before that crash, President Trump says, no, resign, even though we have a shortage. He then tapped Elon Musk to lead the efforts to remake the FAA, despite his clear conflicts of interest. Musk leads the largest private space company, SpaceX, which is regulated. Oh, a theme here, which is regulated by the FAA. And just this fall, the FAA. So I believe the last thing Americans need is President Trump allowing a self-interested, unvetted billionaire with massive conflicts of interest to do whatever he wants to destroy agencies that oversee his companies where he's making huge profits. Well, maybe they're going to go after the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration next. This agency is tasked with ensuring that all cars on our roads are safe and reliable, and safety requirements like reporting on crashes that involve his partially automated vehicles. If we continue to let President Trump and Musk unilaterally decide which agencies can function and even exist, our roads and skies are going to be more dangerous and more Americans will die. Or maybe President Trump will make good on his again and again, willing to peddle disinformation, overstep his authority, and break the law. Getting rid of FEMA would mean the federal government is abandoning Americans before, during, and after disasters like wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, and even floods. And while I'm sure everyone here would agree FEMA can and should be reformed, and I'll lead that charge to make sure that they better meet the needs of disaster survivors, it still plays a critical role. And American lives and helping communities rebuild after an increasingly common and more destructive natural disasters is something we should be focused on. Federal teams and communication infrastructures can save lives in the aftermath of a disaster. FEMA also administers billions of dollars of mitigation grants to reduce the impact of natural hazards, which can save lives, protect property. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can look at these other changes that we're seeing to see whether or not it's fraud or abuse, and whether or not that is something that we need to examine. So I would hope in future hearings we will take a look at an unvetted, highly conflicted person making these choices to understand what is behind their actions.
Senator Langford.
Thank you, Chairman Paul. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Actually, yesterday I released my 8th report, what we call federal fumbles in abuse, in fraud, or improper payments, and try to be able to highlight those and shine some sunshine on them to hopefully get rid of them and to be able to make tax dollars more efficient in the way we're spending on this. Many of those things, as you can imagine full well, were foreign aid related that we have talked about over the last several years, including this year as well. We highlighted that the federal government and the American taxpayer paid for 12 drag shows in Ecuador. I'm not sure why the people of Ecuador couldn't pay for their own drag shows, but it defunded fisheries in Algeria, where they literally built a fish farm in the middle of the desert among a people that don't eat fish, actually, in their normal diet because they live in the desert. They don't normally eat fish, and we're not interested in eating the fish, but American taxpayers and my Oklahoma taxpayers paid for those, and that has become an issue for me. There was a study that was done by the NEH on humans, how we did a study with Oklahoma tax dollars to study the effect of climate change on European butterflies. Again, I don't know why the Europeans couldn't pay for that. We did a study on the effects of COVID-19 on the Russians. Again, not sure why the Russians couldn't have paid for that. And one of my favorites of the long list of least favorites here, we did a study on the benefit of seatbelts and helmets on individuals driving in Ghana and don't have to pay a dime to be able to do that study. So over and over and over again, we've highlighted this. The difference now and then is there's a bigger megaphone, and part of the frustration from my friends on the left is Elon Musk is daring to tell 1 billion people on X that this is happening. But when it was only a few people, but if the megaphone gets louder and it gets pointed out more, it becomes more offensive because then it becomes a risk. So I have several things that I want to be able to drill down on. I've talked for years about Voice of America and the messaging they put out. It's supposed to tell the government story of America internationally. What they're actually doing often is talking about murders in America and riots in America and how Trump is ruining Christianity in America, and on and on and on have been the negative stories about America that they're telling to the world on it. Put out globally, that we put out with Oklahoma tax dollars and American tax dollars to tell the American story and how the American story is being told internationally.
Thank you, Senator. I could actually speak a little bit from my experience with the Fulbright. We were thinking about sending abroad, clearly didn't love this country, and clearly had a kind of criticism that I think wasn't the best message that you would affect. So not just
think Americans are better than trashing the idealistic goals that have motivated our nation over the years, but putting aside the humanitarian instincts behind some of USAID, here's what American farmers have said in reaction to these actions. President of the Iowa Farmers Union said, quote, USAID is important for farmers. It's unfortunate that we would drop those relationships that we have built over time, end quote. The Ohio Farmer Union president said, quote, USAID plays a crucial role, not only providing food aid to millions around the world, but also directly purchasing grains from Ohio farmers. Ohio farmers are more than capable of rising to the challenge of feeding the world, but they need stability to do so. In shuttering USAID, President Trump is pulling billions of dollars away from American farmers without apparently a second thought. That's a lot of harm, that's a lot of waste, and a lot of abuse to people who are the backbone of food production in this nation. Already, a lot of their labor, investment, produce, going to waste as a result of the Musk power grab, slash and trash agencies in the name of eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, but in fact creating it and profiting from it. Elon Musk is giving America the middle finger in seizing power, engaging in the biggest heist of information in America's history, delving into agencies and destroying them when his own corporations profit from contracts with them, and controlling contracts in the future that will benefit his corporations. That's waste and fraud, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The accusation or criticism has been made that this is an unserious hearing full of conspiracy theorists. Well, you know, the Democrats were asked to participate like they always are, the same way we were when we were in the minority. They could have brought a witness. They chose not to even bring a witness. I can't conjecture as to why, but maybe it's because it's so embarrassing, the stuff that USAID is spending their money on. Who could possibly be against ending $2 million for sex change surgeries in Guatemala? I mean, who wants to defend that? I haven't heard anybody yet defend the waste and malfeasance that's going over there. $3 million for girl-centric climate change. Maybe there's not a witness here. Maybe it's not serious. Question. There is a legal question. If there's $40 billion in USAID, and they question, and it may come to that. But I don't think any court is going to find that the executive branch cannot pause and audit spending. I mean, to crassly say and just to jump to this, it's illegal, it's unlawful, it's a tragedy, it's constitutional chaos. Well, auditing spending, generation, that's why we're finding this stuff. It's been creeping up for a generation. $4.8 million for social media influencers in Ukraine. I mean, if people want to defend that, step forward and defend it. We are finding waste and malfeasance. You also have to realize that when you have a social agenda, and your social agenda is, you know, LGBT, well, when you take that to on them and fly flags, what ends up happening is that doesn't increase diplomacy, that actually goes against diplomacy. I don't care what people's views are on any of these subjects. You can have any view on LGBT, but it shouldn't be part of foreign policy to force this on everybody around the world. It just isn't part of government and should never be part. With the courage including the advice of Elon Musk, including the advice of a lot of us who have been saying for years, we need to look at USAID and make sure that they aren't committing fraud. Look, this morning, the CFO of FEMA was fired because she's spending $54 million on luxury hotels for illegal. Riley's killer, we flew him and put him up in a luxury hotel in New York. He was there for a few months. We spent all of our money on his meals, and then we flew him to Atlanta. And then he drifted over to Athens, and then he killed Laken Riley. Most Americans think that with the courage to say no, to go over there and put a padlock on the door and take the name down. But ultimately, there will be a legal question. Can he impound it, or will it have to come back to Congress? I actually, frankly, think the better way is spend about $30 billion and send $10 billion back, and we do a rescission. There is a method for doing that, and I hope that is what is done. But even on the impoundment question, there are questions exactly, and I don't think it's ever made. A pause in funding is an impoundment. A pause in funding to do an audit is just good government, frankly. The question I have for the panel is this, though.
Mr. Chairman, may I just inquire?
Sure.
Because the chairman mentioned that we don't have a minority witness because the ranking member isn't here and I don't purport to speak for him.
We're docking your time for next week. I'm just kidding.
But I would respectfully suggest that we have Paul Martin, who was fired as Inspector General, come before us.
We didn't deny any witnesses. Your side did not put forward a witness. We did not deny any witnesses. You didn't put forward a witness. Me to call this unserious and a conspiracy, a bunch of conspiracy. It's an attack on our witnesses as well. That is a pejorative, and that's name calling. All right, you're welcome to object to things they say and have facts to counter them, but to call this an unserious hearing of conspiracy
I never used that term, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you said it wasn't serious. You said the hearing wasn't serious. And the thing is, y'all chose not to participate in it, so that's on you.
Maybe we can have a second hearing because this is such an important
We can
topic.
have a dozen. I'm not criticizing your ranking member for being unserious or a conspiracy theory. He has his opinions. We make our arguments both sides, but if we call names and say, oh, well, your ideas are conspiracy theory, that's a pejorative, and that doesn't get us anywhere, frankly. And because it's also dangerous in the sense that many people who are then say, oh, it's a conspiracy. 23 scientists come forward in Lancet and say that the possibility that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan was a conspiracy theory. And then government promoted back to Twitter and others and met with them on a weekly basis trying to suppress. Facebook for a year and a half said that ideas like mine that it could have come from the lab were to be suppressed. Michael Schellenberger, why don't you, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, sure. And also, I would think whenever you hear somebody accuse somebody of a conspiracy theory, I think you should consider that they are themselves spreading disinformation. In other words, we know that the proximal origins paper that you're describing there, that we know from their internal discussions that those scientists were pursuing the lab leak theory. We saw it in their Slack messages. And then they got a phone call. They talked from the higher ups. And then they repeatedly that term used to dismiss very serious evidence of misconduct and of actual conspiracies. We've seen the rise of an entire censorship industrial complex. There's no theorizing here. These are just the facts of the censorship industrial complex that was created by the Department of Homeland Security starting in 2021. Really started before that in 2020, all the way culminating to the Disinformation Governance Board, which was so Orwellian that even Democrats had to back away.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you and the ranking member. For years, I have worked on a bipartisan basis to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse within the federal government, including on bills with you, Mr. Chair. These efforts are critical to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent efficiently. If this committee and press together to support and bolster inspectors general. Inspectors general are indispensable watchdogs who identify multi-million-dollar overpayments to big corporations, exactly what Elon Musk claims he wants to root out. To use just the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services as an example, last year the HHS Inspector General exposed $35 million in improper Medicare payments after equipment companies charged the government for thousands of catheters for patients after the HHS Inspector General helped uncover that they had fraudulently submitted at least $20 million in false Medicare claims for cancer medication. All told, The HHS Inspector General identified $7 billion last year in waste, fraud, and abuse within the department. But did President Trump and Elon Musk support and empower inspectors general? No. At least 17 inspectors general in a move to silence those who would provide accountability and oversight over his administration. And since their firing, we are growing to get a better picture of why they were fired. Just yesterday, we found out that the State Department is planning to buy $400 million in armored vehicles from Elon Musk's Tesla company. Elon Musk, after clearing out the watchdogs, the president decided to unleash chaos and confusion on Granite Staters and Americans through an illegal order to cut off nearly all federal grants. These are grants that fire departments count on to upgrade their equipment, police departments use to hire officers to protect our streets, and shelters need to provide homeless veterans a place to sleep. While federal courts have temporarily halted the president's funding cutoff, they have been awarded, that we appropriated, that is law. This is the real cost of the illegal move by President Trump to cut off funding. Granite Staters left in the lurch, not knowing how much longer their community health center will remain open. The American people want relief from high costs, and they want their government to work. But as inflation and egg prices soar, the president illegally fired the people, the very people, who root out waste and fraud and have a track record in groups. I urge the president to reverse course and for this committee to work together to find common sense ways to address the challenges that Americans are facing today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a great hearing. As you know, the federal government is spending money like it's going down. And the revenues were $5.2 trillion. Nobody in this country can do that. Nobody can do it in their personal life. Businesses can't do it, only the federal government. We're being forced to borrow another $1.9 trillion to make up for it. It's one of the reasons that we now have over $36 trillion worth of debt, and we're heading quickly to 37. Over the last 4 years, while the population has grown 2%, the federal government has spent, they've added $8 trillion to national debt in 4 years. This is not sustainable. If nothing changes, our federal government is on track to add $1 trillion to the federal debt every 180 days. The cost of this debt is another massive problem. Right now, more than $1 trillion of money that hardworking Americans pay in taxes each year is just going to pay the interest on their federal debt. That's a waste. So I'm very appreciative of what President Trump's doing and what DOJ is doing one by one and finding out how every single dollar is spent and making sure it's spent in the best interest of the American public. Unfortunately, many Democrats among this committee have expressed outrage. But the outrage is better suited for some of the absurd, wasteful spending they've already uncovered. Let's look at USAID. They provided full funding for al-Qaeda terrorist Anwar $1 million to start a Palestinian cement factory, which is used to help Hamas build terror tunnels into Gaza. How can you be this stupid? Another $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces and to business communities. How does that help an American? $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. How does that help America? $2.5 million for electric vehicles in Vietnam. How does that help America? A multi-year study for grants to radical organizations, $122 million going to groups aligned with designated terrorists. How does that help Americans? And billions more to add charities that have histories of failing to vet their terror-tied partners. The families I represent would agree that's not how they want their tax dollars spent. They'd rather have their tax dollars spent putting Americans first or advancing our interests abroad. So I'm very appreciative of what President Trump has done. I appreciate what DOJ is doing, and I appreciate that Marco Rubio, our ex-colleague, is doing running the state. So, Mr. Schellenberger, DOJ also discovered that the Biden administration spent millions of dollars on subscriptions to left-leaning media outlets like Politico. The Biden administration censored certain media and Americans' online media outlets to favor them. How is this not a conflict of interest, and what do you think of this?
Yeah, I agree it's a huge conflict of interest, and it's really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, what we uncovered in our reporting is that the USAID has basically been bankrolling an organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which has been in the process over the last decade and a half of really taking over so-called independent investigative journalism around the world, aimed to really undermine the independence of investigative journalism. When we started investigating these guys, they threatened to sue us right away. They have a $9 million fund just to sue people. It's called Reporters Shield, but it's an offensive weapon that they use to basically shut down any inquiry into what they're doing. And we've even seen now, we've now traced that USAID money to investigations that were essential to the 2019 impeachment of President Donald Trump, and then also to the Russiagate hoax, particularly spreading misinformation and malinformation about Trump's alleged ties to the Russians. Of course, one of the greatest conspiracy theory of the recent era, Deutsche Bank, and that there were Russians, oligarchs who also banked with Deutsche Bank, that there had to be some sort of a conspiracy. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, sir. It's really a deep corruption of so-called mainstream independent media.
Based on your investigation, you also talk about how USAID transfers funds between projects, making it hard for anybody to sort of track the funds. Can you elaborate?
Well, sure. And so part of what happened is that one of the media organizations in Germany, one of their big television stations, and USAID admitted on camera that they had routed money from the State Department's Law Enforcement Bureau through USAID just for optics reasons, admitting on camera that they did that because they thought they knew that it would look bad for an investigative journalism organization to be supported by effectively the cops, by law enforcement. That's not good journalism practice. That violates basically every code of ethics. He has to agree to OCCRP's work plan, and that they have to agree to their key staff. And this was all literally recorded on video, USAID officials saying this. Then afterwards, OCCRP denied it. They just said that that wasn't true. It just asserted that it was false. So, I mean, really what you're looking at with OCCRP and also Internews is that these are really vectors of disinformation. They spread disinformation and then demand censorship on the basis of it. That's what they did with the COVID lab leak, conspiracy theory that it could have come from a lab, when of course their own scientists suspected that's what it was, and then they demanded censorship on the basis of it. Same thing happened with Hunter Biden, and we see that playbook, I think, underway here today, where when journalists start to expose these misdeeds, they just project and say, you're spreading a conspiracy theory, and of course that has been traditionally the basis for demanding censorship.
In 2022, the Biden administration donated $344 million to United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees, and continued to donate hundreds of millions of dollars throughout 2023 and during the Israeli-Hamas war. We now know Hamas terrorists were stealing food and supplies intended for humanitarian purposes. So was the U.S. government funding a terrorist organization?
It sure looks like that, and I haven't invested enough to remember what we were learning